They fined me $250,000 without warning. They threatened liens, lawsuits, even eviction. What they didn't realize, I owned the neighborhood they were trying to control. It started on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. The kind where nothing feels out of place and you're already halfway through your coffee before checking the mail. Mixed in with the usual flyers and utility notices was a thick, official-looking envelope stamped with the HOA's logo. At first, I assumed it was another routine reminder about landscaping or parking rules annoying. Sure, but nothing unusual. I set it aside, finished what I was doing, and only opened it later that afternoon. That delay turned out to be the calm before the storm. The moment I unfolded the letter, my stomach dropped. Printed in bold, unmistakable numbers near the top of the page was the amount. $250,000. For a split second, I genuinely thought it had to be a typo. Maybe an extra zero. Maybe a formatting error. But as I read on, the words made it painfully clear this was not a mistake. The HOA was formally notifying me that I had been fined $250,000 for ongoing, severe, and willful violations of community standards. My eyes scanned the list of alleged offenses in disbelief. They claimed unauthorized modifications to property structures, non-compliant use of land, repeated refusal to cooperate with inspections, and even activities detrimental to the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. The language was stiff, legal, and clearly designed to intimidate. Each accusation was written as if the case had already been decided, as if guilt were a given and the fine merely a formality. What made it worse was the tone. There was no invitation to discuss the matter, no request for clarification, no warning or opportunity to resolve anything beforehand. Instead, the letter demanded payment within 30 days and threatened liens, legal action, and further financial penalties if I failed to comply. It read less like a notice and more like a verdict handed down by a court that hadn't bothered to hear my side. Confusion quickly turned into anger. I went back through my memory, trying to pinpoint what I could have possibly done to justify such an absurd amount. I hadn't built anything new. Hadn't changed my property in any way that wasn't already approved. And certainly hadn't ignored any formal warnings because there hadn't been any. Yet here was the HOA, acting as if I'd been deliberately undermining their authority for years. As the shock settled, a heavier realization crept in. This wasn't about rules or violations. This was about power. The HOA believed they could drop an enormous fine without explanation, counting on fear to do the rest. They assumed I'd panic, call a lawyer in desperation, or quietly pay a settlement just to make the problem disappear. In their minds, this was probably routine another homeowner put in their place. I folded the letter slowly and set it down. My coffee now long forgot. The number $250,000 echoed in my head. Not because I was afraid of it, but because of the sheer audacity behind it. They were so confident, so certain of their control, that they never once questioned whether they actually had the authority to make such a demand. And that confidence, I realized, was about to be their biggest mistake. Not even 24 hours after the letter arrived, the pressure started. First came the email, short, formal, and dripping with false politeness. They strongly encouraged me to resolve the matter quickly to avoid unnecessary escalation. Each message repeated the same threats outlined in the notice, as if sheer repetition would make the fine feel inevitable. It was clear they expected fear to kick in immediately, the kind that makes people act before they think. When I didn't respond right away, the tone shifted. The emails grew longer and colder, packed with legal jargon and highlighted clauses from the HOA bylaws. They cited sections I'd never even heard of, twisting vague language into supposed proof that they could fine me however much they pleased. It was intimidation by paperwork. Overwhelm the homeowner, bury them in rules, and hope they give up before asking real questions. A few days later, the calls began. At first, they came during business hours, then in the evenings, and finally early in the morning. Each voicemail carried the same message. Failure to cooperate would leave the board with no choice but to pursue aggressive enforcement. One caller even suggested that paying sooner might reflect favorably. If the HOA decided to reconsider future penalties. It sounded less like a governing body and more like a collection agency testing how far they could push. Things escalated when they showed up in person. Two board members and the property manager walked onto my driveway one afternoon, clipboards in hand, acting as if they already owned the place. They claimed they were there for an inspection, despite having no appointment and no legal notice. When I asked them to leave, they smirked and warned me that refusing access would only add to the record. Their confidence was almost impressive, built entirely on the assumption that I had no real power to resist. Behind the scenes, they started working the neighborhood. Neighbors I'd known for years suddenly avoided eye contact or asked cautious questions about what I'd done. The HOA had quietly spread the narrative that I was a problem homeowner, someone threatening property values and community order. It was social pressure layered on top of financial fear, a tactic designed to isolate and embarrass me into compliance. Every move followed the same pattern: assert authority, threaten consequences, and never allow space for discussion. They didn't ask for evidence, didn't invite mediation, and didn't seem remotely interested in whether their accusations were accurate. In their world, the HOA's word was final, and homeowners existed only to obey. But as overwhelming as it all felt, something about their behavior didn't add up. They were acting with an urgency that went beyond normal enforcement, almost as if they needed me to submit quickly. The harder they pushed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about proving dominance. They believed intimidation would break me. What they didn't realize was that every email, every call, and every unannounced visit only strengthened my resolve to look deeper into what they were really allowed to do and what they weren't. After days of nonstop pressure, I finally did what the HOA never expected me to do. I stopped reacting emotionally and started digging. If they were so confident in their authority, I wanted to know exactly where that confidence came from. I pulled out every document I had: purchase agreements, deeds, old emails, closing statements, and records I hadn't looked at in years. What started as a defensive move quickly turned into something far more interesting. Late one night, while going through property records, a familiar detail jumped out at me. It was something I'd always known but had never imagined would matter like this. When I originally invested in the area, I hadn't just bought my own home. Over time, through a series of quiet, completely legal transactions, I had acquired multiple properties throughout the neighborhood. Some were rentals, others were held under different entities. A few had been purchased long before the HOA ever existed in its current form. That was when the realization hit. The HOA was treating me like a single, isolated homeowner, but on paper, that wasn't even close to the truth. I wasn't just a resident subject to their rules. I was one of the largest property holders in the entire development. In fact, when I added it all up, my ownership stake outweighed that of any individual board member and, collectively, a significant portion of the association itself. I kept digging, this time into the HOA's own formation documents. Buried deep in the bylaws and covenants were clauses about voting power, quorum requirements, and enforcement authority. The language was dry and dense, clearly written to discourage anyone from actually reading it. But once I slowed down and followed the logic, the picture became clear. The HOA's power depended entirely on ownership percentages. Votes weren't T1 per household, they were weighted by property interest. And that's where everything started to unravel for them. Based on those rules, I realized something they clearly hadn't bothered to verify. With the properties I owned directly and indirectly, I controlled a massive share of the voting power. Enough to block fines, enough to call special meetings, enough, if pushed, to replace board members outright. The authority they were waving around so confidently only existed because they assumed no one would challenge it. What shocked me most wasn't the discovery itself, but how careless the HOA had been. A simple title search would have told them everything. A basic review of ownership records would have revealed that I wasn't just another name on their mailing list. Instead, they relied on intimidation and habit, assuming every homeowner was equally powerless and uninformed. In that moment, the fear I'd felt since opening the letter vanished completely. The $250,000 fine stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a liability for them. They had issued a massive penalty without proper authority, without due process, and against someone who, by their own governing documents, had more control over the neighborhood than they did. I closed the folder and leaned back, letting the weight of it sink in. The HOA thought they were cornering me. In reality, they had just handed me the leverage. All that remained was deciding when and how to let them discover the truth they had overlooked. The notice for the HOA meeting arrived a week later. And this time, I didn't ignore it. According to the agenda, my violation case was scheduled as a primary discussion point, framed as if the outcome were already decided. They expected a confrontation where I'd either beg for leniency or argue defensively while they held all the cards. I decided to attend, not to argue, but to watch how confident they'd be once the facts were laid out. The meeting room was packed. Board members sat at the front, papers neatly stacked, faces rehearsed into expressions of authority. A few residents filled the chairs behind me, whispering quietly, clearly curious about the homeowner who supposedly racked up a $250,000 fine. When my name was called, the HOA president launched into a polished summary of my noncompliance, speaking slowly and deliberately, as if educating the room on a cautionary tale. I listened without interrupting. Every accusation was delivered with certainty, each one followed by a reminder of the fine and the looming legal consequences. They talked about liens, court filings, and the importance of setting an example. The board nodded along, confident that this public display would pressure me into submission. When they finally asked if I had anything to say, the room went quiet. That's when I calmly asked a single question. Before we go any further, can you confirm the voting interest you're using to enforce this fine? The president hesitated, clearly not expecting it. A board member flipped through papers, then responded with a vague explanation about standard enforcement authority. I followed up by asking them to confirm whether they reviewed the current ownership records tied to my name and associated entities. The shift in the room was immediate. Confidence gave way to confusion. Whispers spread as I placed copies of property records and HOA bylaws on the table, highlighting the sections that mattered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply explained, step by step, how voting power worked and how much of it I controlled under their own rules. As the realization settled in, the president's face went pale. Another board member leaned back in their chair, suddenly very interested in the ceiling. The property manager stopped taking notes altogether. What had been framed as a disciplinary hearing was rapidly turning into something else entirely, a reckoning. I finished by stating, calmly and clearly, that the fine had been issued without proper authority, without a valid vote, and without regard for ownership percentages. I reminded them that continuing enforcement under those conditions exposed the HOA to serious legal risk. For the first time, no one interrupted me. The room was silent when I sat down. The power dynamic had flipped completely. The board no longer looked like enforcers, they looked like people realizing they'd overplayed their hand in front of an audience. In that moment, it became painfully clear to everyone present that the HOA hadn't just misjudged a homeowner. They had challenged the one person who could dismantle their authority entirely, simply by following the rules they thought no one would ever read. The meeting ended without a vote, without a ruling, and without a single threat. That alone said everything. The same board that had been so eager to fine me into submission suddenly needed time to review the documents. Within 24 hours, the tone of every communication changed. The emails were no longer aggressive or demanding. They were cautious, carefully worded, and filled with phrases like clarification, temporary suspension, and procedural review. A week later, I received a formal notice stating that the $250,000 fine was being withdrawn pending further investigation. No apology, of course, but no demands either. The HOA had quietly realized that pushing forward would expose more than just a procedural mistake. It would expose how recklessly they operated, how little they understood their own governing documents, and how vulnerable they were if someone decided to push back the right way. Behind closed doors, the fallout was already spreading. 2 board members resigned within a month, citing personal reasons. The property manager was replaced shortly after, following what the HOA vaguely referred to as a restructuring. Word traveled fast through the neighborhood. The same neighbors who had avoided me before now stopped to ask what really happened. Some admitted they'd been fined unfairly in the past but had paid out of fear, believing resistance was pointless. What struck me most was how quickly the balance of power shifted once the illusion of authority cracked. The HOA hadn't lost power because of lawsuits or protests, it lost power because someone finally read the rules and held them to their own standards. Once residents realized that enforcement wasn't absolute, that fines weren't untouchable, the board could no longer operate in the shadows. In the months that followed, new policies were introduced. Fines required clearer documentation. Inspections needed proper notice. Votes were recorded and shared openly. On paper, the HOA became more transparent and restrained, not because they suddenly valued fairness, but because they learned what happens when overreach meets accountability. As for me, I didn't dismantle the HOA, even though I could have. I didn't replace the board or leverage my ownership for control. I simply made it clear that intimidation would no longer work. The properties I owned continued operating as they always had. But now, every interaction with the HOA came with a level of respect that had been noticeably absent before. Looking back, the $250,000 fine was never really about money. It was about testing boundaries. The HOA assumed they could flex their authority without consequence. Instead, they triggered a chain reaction that exposed their weaknesses to everyone watching. By the time it was over, the fine was gone, the board was shaken, and the neighborhood had learned a quiet but powerful lesson. Authority only works when people believe in it, and it collapses the moment someone is willing to challenge it with facts instead of fear. If you enjoy real stories where bullies overplay their power and get exposed, make sure you're resubscribed. New stories like this drop every week.